There's something fascinating about how humans once explained the world. Before science, before telescopes or microscopes, stories were the only tools people had to make sense of everything they didn't understand. Thunder, sickness, birth, death, all of it had to come from somewhere. So they created stories, grand ones, emotional ones, stories that comforted, frightened, and controlled. But some of these stories, still believed today, sound absurd when stripped of reverence. Take the story of Jonah, swallowed by a giant fish and living inside it for 3 days. If this happened, the man would have suffocated, dissolved in stomach acid, or simply never fit through a whale's throat. Yet millions repeat it as fact. Why? Because questioning it feels wrong. Tradition replaces evidence. Or think of the tale of Balaam's donkey, an animal that suddenly speaks fluent human language because an angel blocks the road. People read that and nod along, as if the laws of biology took a brief holiday. Religious texts are full of these. Talking snakes, global floods that somehow reset all of human and animal life, and a sun that literally stops in the sky to let an army finish a battle. No one asks how the planet could just pause its rotation without erasing everything alive through cataclysmic force. The story matters more than physics. The strangeness doesn't end there. Many cultures claim gods impregnated women, created worlds in 7 days, or shaped humans from dirt and ribs. They sound poetic, until you realize they're explanations that would never survive a basic school science experiment. What's truly fascinating is how these stories survive modern knowledge. People can land robots on Mars, decode DNA, and model black holes. Yet some still believe the universe began because a supernatural being made light appear before the sun existed. The human brain loves patterns and meaning. It hates uncertainty. So when faced with big questions, where did we come from, why are we here, it accepts stories that sound comforting, not stories that are true. Religious narratives were never meant to describe reality. They were emotional survival tools. Myths gave ancient people a way to structure chaos. But the problem begins when these old fables are treated as literal history, long after evidence proved otherwise. Faith turned metaphor into law. That's how stories meant to teach values became barriers to understanding. Once sacred imagination becomes untouchable fact, progress stalls. Because then asking, "Does this make sense?" becomes dangerous. Some of the strangest stories come not from forgotten mythologies, but from scriptures still treated as divine truth. Stories that, if found in any other book, would be dismissed as fairy tales for children. Take the tale of Noah's Ark. A man, we're told, was instructed by God to build a massive wooden ship to hold every species of animal on Earth, 2 of each kind, plus his family, while the world was drowned in water. For 40 days and nights, everything else supposedly perished. Let's pause there. The logistics alone are impossible. The number of animal species today is in the millions. Even if only land animals were included, there's no ship in human history that could carry that many creatures, their food, and their waste for over a month. And yet, this story is told to children as moral truth, as if the survival of penguins and tigers on one wooden boat makes more sense than explaining biodiversity through evolution. Then there's the Tower of Babel. Humanity, united in language and purpose, tries to build a tower tall enough to reach heaven. God, apparently threatened by their ambition, confuses their languages to stop them. The story's moral is obedience, but beneath that is a strange idea, that curiosity and collaboration are punishable acts. It's an ancient warning against thinking too big. What's remarkable is how such tales were shaped by human fear. Fear of chaos, fear of disobedience, fear of knowledge itself. In most religious myths, curiosity is the first sin. Adam and Eve's story starts with the desire for knowledge. The snake, the so-called villain, tells them the truth, that eating the fruit won't kill them. They eat it, they gain awareness, and they're punished forever. If you strip away the sacred tone, the story's message is clear. Stay ignorant, and you'll be safe. Think for yourself, and you'll suffer. That theme repeats across traditions. Questioning is seen as pride. Obedience is seen as virtue. Those who ask too many questions, the Prometheuses, the Galileos, the Reformers, are treated as dangerous. It's no coincidence that religions often turn their harshest punishments on thinkers who doubt. But what's truly odd is how believers compartmentalize. The same people who accept these stories literally would laugh at similar tales from other religions. A Christian might scoff at the Hindu belief in elephant-headed gods, or at ancient Greek myths of Zeus turning into animals. Yet they see no issue with a man walking on water or returning from the dead. The inconsistency isn't moral, it's psychological. People are taught to see their own myths as sacred truth and others as nonsense, but from a neutral standpoint, they're equally improbable. And when stories like these dictate real-world laws, education, and morality, they stop being harmless tales. They become systems that decide who deserves respect, who can marry whom, who gets punished for doubt. Ancient fables weren't designed for a modern world. They were symbolic attempts to explain thunder and disease, not blueprints for ethics or government. Yet billions still turn to them for answers about reality itself. The problem isn't that these stories exist, it's that they're still mistaken for truth. And when faith outruns evidence, reason becomes the enemy. The lesser-known stories are often even stranger, the ones not quoted in sermons or children's books, but still part of sacred texts. They reveal the mindset of the people who wrote them, and how easily myth can masquerade as truth, when fear and reverence silence questions. There's the story of Elisha, the prophet who curses a group of children for mocking his baldness. In response, 2 bears come out of the woods and maul 42 of them. This is written as a display of divine justice. It's hard to imagine a moral lesson here, except perhaps, don't insult a holy man, or nature itself will kill you. Yet this is presented not as cruelty, but righteousness. Or take the bizarre ritual in Numbers, where a priest makes a woman accused of adultery drink bitter water, mixed with temple dust, to prove her guilt. She's innocent, she survives. If guilty, her body swells and she dies. No investigation, no evidence, just superstition disguised as divine law. These stories might sound absurd today, but they expose something timeless. How power uses fear to enforce obedience. The threat of divine punishment, floods, plagues, hellfire, was a perfect tool for social control long before modern governments or science existed. The same pattern shows up in countless faiths. Ancient Egyptians believed the sun god sailed a celestial boat every night through the underworld, fighting a serpent of chaos so the sun could rise again. The Norse believed the world was created from the corpse of a giant. The Aztecs thought the gods demanded human hearts to keep the universe alive. Different cultures, same logic. The universe is scary and unpredictable, so invent a story that makes it feel ordered. It's a psychological defense mechanism, a way to shrink the vast, indifferent cosmos into something personal and manageable. But that comfort came at a cost. The moment people began mistaking these symbolic stories for literal truth, anyone who questioned them became dangerous. And this is what makes these stories so persistent. They weren't built on reason. They were built on emotion. Fear of death, hope for meaning, need for belonging. Myths survive because they satisfy those needs far more easily than facts do. Modern religion still operates on that principle. When people face tragedy, they don't turn to biology or astrophysics for comfort. They turn to the same kind of stories their ancestors told around fires. Stories about plans, purpose, eternal life, justice beyond the grave. They sound comforting, but they rest on the same logic that gave us talking animals and magic trees. Even stranger, many believers will defend these tales passionately, while rejecting others from their own scripture that sound too absurd. Few people today believe Lot's wife literally turned into a pillar of salt for looking back at a city, but they'll still argue that Moses parted a sea by raising his hands. The line between metaphor and miracle moves conveniently, always protecting faith, never truth. And that's what makes these stories so resilient. They adapt. They blur the boundary between myth and moral. But beneath the adaptation, they remain what they've always been. attempts to explain the unexplainable with imagination instead of evidence. The irony is that religion often criticizes modern people for being too skeptical, too rational, too cold. But skepticism is exactly what allowed humanity to move beyond these fables, to replace superstition with understanding. The more we learned about the world, the more we realized how unnecessary those old explanations were. Lightning wasn't Zeus, disease wasn't sin, rainbows weren't divine promises. Yet the stories endure because they're not just beliefs, they're identities. The influence of these ancient tales goes far beyond temples and scriptures. They shaped how people see morality, justice, and even themselves. Most believers don't notice how much of their worldview is built on the same fables they would never accept in any other context. For example, many people still base their sense of good and evil on the story of divine command, the idea that morality comes from a higher being. But if you look closely at the stories used to justify that belief, they're filled with moral contradictions. In one chapter, a god forbids murder. In the next, he orders entire populations to be wiped out, men, women, and children. If these are moral lessons, what are they teaching? That right and wrong depend not on compassion or reason, but on who's giving the order. Stories like Abraham being told to sacrifice his son are often praised as examples of faith. But if this story appeared in any other religion, it would be called what it is: a horror story about blind obedience. It teaches that loyalty to authority matters more than human empathy. It's hard to imagine a more dangerous message. These tales shaped cultures for centuries, justifying wars, hierarchies, and oppression. When divine stories declare that kings rule by heaven's will, or that women must obey men because of Eve's sin, those beliefs stop being questioned. They become tradition. And tradition, no matter how cruel, always finds defenders. The strangest part is that even in a world that values science and evidence, people still hold on to myths that collapse under simple scrutiny. The idea of eternal punishment, for example. Billions believe that a being of infinite love will torture humans forever for finite mistakes. It's a moral contradiction so deep that it should collapse on itself. Yet it persists because fear is powerful, and stories that trigger fear tend to survive. Psychologically, these stories work because they play with two instincts: the desire for justice and the fear of chaos. People want to believe the wicked will suffer, and the good will be rewarded. So they accept stories of divine retribution, even if those same stories portrayed justice as endless suffering. When people were told that floods, plagues, or disasters were divine punishment, it gave them a sense of order. If tragedy had a reason, then the universe wasn't random. But that illusion of order came with guilt and control. The same logic that blamed ancient farmers for droughts is still used today, when preachers claim earthquakes or diseases are punishment for sin. And these ideas influence real decisions. They shape how societies handle guilt, sexuality, death, and human rights. People still quote ancient stories to decide who deserves equality, or who's allowed to love whom. The cost of believing these fables isn't just intellectual, it's human. The problem isn't faith itself, it's the refusal to separate ancient moral poetry from objective truth. When an old parable about sin becomes a rule book for life, compassion becomes conditional, and reason becomes suspicious. What makes it even more tragic is that many of these myths were never meant to be literal. They were symbolic, attempts to describe emotions and ethics before philosophy or psychology existed. But centuries of repetition turned symbols into dogma. The metaphors fossilized. So now, instead of inspiring thought, they demand submission. Instead of inviting reflection, they shut down inquiry. The old stories survive, not because they make sense, but because they've been repeated for so long that they feel true. But repetition is not proof. What's most revealing about these stories isn't their absurdity, but how deeply they reveal our human need for meaning. People cling to them not because they make sense, but because they offer comfort. They turn fear into narrative. They give life a script where everything, even suffering, has a reason. And that's what makes them powerful. but also dangerous. Because when a culture mistakes comfort for truth, it stops growing. Throughout history, progress came from people who dared to say, maybe these stories aren't true. Every scientific discovery began with a refusal to accept divine explanations. When people once said disease came from sin, someone had to ask, what if it comes from bacteria? When others believed the stars were fixed lights placed by gods, someone had to insist, let's measure them. And that is where human knowledge diverged from myth, not through rebellion, but through curiosity. But religion teaches people that doubt is weakness, that skepticism is pride. And so even now, in a world connected by data and evidence, old tales still hold enormous influence. People reject evolution but believe in global floods. They mock the myths of others but protect their own as sacred. They speak of truth while living inside stories written by men who thought the earth was flat. The persistence of these tales shows how little our psychology has evolved compared to our technology. We build machines that think, but many still believe morality requires an invisible overseer. We decode the genome, yet ancient origin stories still dictate school curricula. Even the structure of these myths follows the same emotional pattern: a fall from grace, a promise of redemption, and a final reward or punishment. It's a story that flatters human vanity, that the universe revolves around us, that our lives are cosmic tests, that we are watched, judged, and destined for eternity. It's dramatic, it's comforting, and it's almost certainly false, but acknowledging that doesn't make life meaningless. In fact, it makes it more real. When we stop seeing ourselves as characters in divine theater, we start taking responsibility for our world. We no longer wait for justice from the sky. We build it ourselves. The greatest irony of religious stories is that their beauty lies not in their literal truth, but in what they accidentally reveal about humanity. They show our longing to understand, our fear of the unknown, our desire for purpose. The stories themselves may be foolish, but the emotions behind them are profoundly human. The real wisdom isn't in defending them, it's in outgrowing them. To appreciate their poetry without being ruled by their claims. To see them as early drafts of understanding, not eternal manuals for truth. And when you look at them that way, something shifts. You stop laughing at their absurdities and start realizing what they represent, the birth pains of human thought. Our first attempts to explain lightning, love, death, and morality. They were necessary once, but they aren't sacred forever. A species that can split atoms, read its own DNA, and explore distant planets no longer needs myths to feel awe. Reality itself is wondrous enough. The real miracle is not in ancient tales of talking animals or floating gardens. It's in our ability to learn, to question, to keep searching. Maybe that's the story that should have been told all along. Not one about divine intervention, but about human discovery. Not one about obedience, but about understanding. And maybe one day, people will look back at these old religious stories and see them for what they are. The childhood dreams of a species just learning how to think. Beautiful, strange, and deeply flawed, but necessary steps on the path to reason. Because the moment we let go of foolish stories, we finally begin to write our own.